Hey everybody, welcome to my channel. This is Main Brew Guy. My name is Gary. So yeah, let's dig into this elusive style. Have you tried to brew a New England IPA and then you look like this after only a few weeks? Chances are you made a mistake that you were told was a myth. Rapid oxidation, undesired polyphenol production, mouthfeel problems, unexpected hop results, and a generally off-balanced beer. New England IPAs are arguably the hardest beers to make. The old adage was if you could make a good Pilsner, then you can make anything. Well, that is no longer the whole truth. The issue with New England IPAs is the complexity and the fragility of the style. In this video, we will go through a few steps from brain to glass to showcase what you need to conquer this pesky style. As homebrewers, we are already at a disadvantage producing this style. Our small-scale brewing is part of the problem. For example, commercial brewers use giant conical fermenters, and on average, every 28 inches of liquid exerts 1 pound of pressure on beer. Therefore, depending on the size of most fermenters, beer is under hydrostatic pressures between 2 and 8 psi on average, even without additional pressure. Homebrewers using a carboy will have virtually no pressure during fermentation. Why is this important? Polyphenol production is inevitable in a hazy IPA, and frankly, you need it. It's required for this style, but it also can be overpowering, and inevitably in a hazy IPA, the large flame-out additions and heavy dry hop additions can really cause an excessive amount of this polyphenol production, which makes the beer really unbalanced and harsh. So the polyphenols we're talking about here is basically that hop bite that you get on a New England IPA, something hazies try to avoid, hazy IPAs, New England IPAs. However, the polyphenols are, like I said, required for that permanent haze, which is a binding process between the proteins and the hop oils. What causes the high polyphenols is basically the high amount of proteins, the beta-glucans, from the flaked malts that bind with the hops and then become overpowering. Fermenting under pressure helps reduce the hop bite or polyphenol production. You will still have polyphenols needed to produce that permanent haze, but not to the extent of overpowering hop bite. 10 psi fermentation pressure helps reduce this problem. It is not a complete cure, but in my experience, it does help tremendously. Things to consider when pressure fermenting is your krausen will be suppressed and your fermentation will be more moderated. What I mean by this is when a traditional fermentation happens, there is critical mass when the yeast colony switches from growth to survival mode. We call this high krausen. If you were to look at a bell curve of a pressure fermenting and non-pressure fermenting, the bell curve on the non-pressure fermenting beer would be a narrower time and a higher amplitude. Whereas the pressure fermented beer, the bell curve would be wider, but the amplitude would be shorter. It is surmised that the excess polyphenol production happens here at peak fermentation. Commercial breweries pressure ferment either by design or on purpose. Homebrewers typically do not, and this is our disadvantage. Also, some of the bigger breweries use a centrifuge that pulls out some of that hop-bound polyphenol matter. This really just improves their time to packaging. So after fermentation, they run it through a centrifuge and then they go straight to bottling and it's out the door. And the beer is 12 to 14 days or less from the time they brewed the beer. The third thing commercial breweries do is they transfer beer in a closed system, never seeing oxygen past the fermentation process. Homebrewers typically do not, although I know there are a lot of us that are coming around to this. Some still don't and swear by it, but if it works for you, good. Now that we got through some of the issues facing homebrewers and the style, let's look at ways to mitigate them. Number one, you at least have to have one corny keg available. Ensure you have a second CO2 gas bottle and a regulator. Also, you'll want to build a spunding valve. Link to how to do that and where to order the parts to build your own are in the comments in the notes. Next thing you'll need is a pressure fermenting vessel. Some of the least expensive ones out there that work very well are the All-Rounder or Firmzilla, which is what I use. And if you're Daddy Warbucks and you can afford a jacketed conical fermenter, kudos to you. Or you can convert a corny keg by cutting the dip tube a little higher with a Dremel tool. So when you do transfer off, you're not transferring off a lot of the sediment off the bottom. Or you can get one of these stainless steel dry hopper keg screens. And this, to me, is probably the best solution. And what you would do is drill a hole through the top of this and then put your dip tube down through the top, and this would sit inside the keg. The dip tube would be inside this screen, so that if you fermented in the corny keg, when it was time to transfer, this screen would act as a filter. Also, you'd probably want to pick up about 4 of these earth magnets. They're stainless steel encased earth magnets. They're very strong, and I'll show you how to use these to make your life a little easier. We'll get to that in a minute. All right, let's get started. First, we have to create a recipe.
All right, everybody, what you're looking at here is Beersmith 3. Most of you probably are already familiar with it. If you don't use Beersmith 3 and you use one of the free online beer recipe creation tools, that's fine. It's very similar. We're going to use Beersmith 3 because it's just like the majority of people use this program. So add a recipe. We're going to go ahead and type in our New England IPA. We're going to take and give ourselves my equipment, which is a 6.5 gallon batch. Just know that when you see some of these numbers here, it's based on a 6.5 gallon batch, not a 5 or a 5.5 gallon batch, which most of you would be using. What I've found, if you want to make a really simple, straightforward New England IPA recipe and have it come out good the first time, this is what you want to do. All right, so we're going to add fermentables. You want to go with Promise. Golden Promise provides a lot of residual sweetness. Now let's start out with 6 pounds here for me. Oh, before we do that, we have to change our style here. Let's put IPA, and then we can just go with New England IPA there. There we go. It's got a nice wide range here, but typically anything under 1060 is probably not going to work out for you as well as you'd hoped. All right, so next thing here, let's go with Pilsner malt. You can use 2-row. I prefer Pilsner malt, and I believe we use a German Pilsner malt, and let's just do 50-50 right now on the base grains. So let's go 6 pounds. That didn't really do a whole lot, so I'm going to bring these up to 7 by hitting the increase amount and see what happens. All right, we're starting to get out of the basement here. Let's go to 7.5 on both. Oops. All right, now let's add some flaked grains, some flaked malts rather, and let's say flaked barley. Let's add 1 pound, and oats. Add 1 pound of that as well, and let's go for the trifecta here, and we'll do flaked wheat. Okay, so this gets us to 1071. Perfect, right in the middle of the range. That's a good start. Let's work on that. So this is our grain bill. It's very simple. The only thing here what we're going to want to do is definitely want to start out with either distilled or RO water, and you'll want to add your water for this recipe. So the water for this recipe, we're just going to go with distilled, and it'll give us the amount of water we're going to have to collect. So there's 10.95 gallons, roughly 11 gallons for a 6.5 gallon batch. those of you doing like 5-gallon batches, about 10 gallons. So you'll know you have to buy about 10 gallons worth of distilled water. This is why I did that. Normally I don't even put it in there. All right, so let's add some hops. All right, so you can use, so there's a bunch of people out there, let's say, don't even bother with a bittering charge at all. I like to lay the groundwork down with a very small bittering charge. And you can do it at 60 minutes or you can do it at 30 minutes. Let's just say, let's do a 30-minute bittering addition. And let's use a really good one here is Warrior or Nugget. That works pretty good. And let's take that down to a half, 0.5. I mean, we're not talking much. Change it to 30 minutes and insert that there. And that just gives us a nice canvas for the rest of this. So the next thing we're going to do is we're going to add our cheater hops. And with the New England IPA, all the hops pretty much go in the whirlpool and dry hops. They're just all typically after flame out additions. So let's use cheater hops. A good cheater hop here is Citra, of course. Everybody likes Citra. Don't bother with Cryo. It's just going to disappoint you. So 3 ounces here at Steep Whirlpool. We're going to whirlpool at 185, and there's a little bit of science behind that temperature, so please use that temperature here. And we're only going to do it for 10 minutes. And we'll look at our alpha acids the day of brewing to make sure that these are correct off the bag of hops that we are using. Okay, but for brevity's sake, we're just going to burn through this here. So hops again, another good cheater hops is Mosaic. Again, don't use Cryo. You can play with them later, but don't bother with them now. We're going to also add 3 ounces, so the total is 6 ounces here. No, not 33. All right, same situation. We're going to go 10 minutes and 185. We'll also look at those alpha acids before we actually go to brew day. And as you can see here, we're starting to hit middle of the road with everything in our numbers and our little sliders here. So we know we're on the right track. So the next thing we want to do is add a few things. Some people swear by Irish moss in the boil. I don't bother with this, but they say that it helps drop some of the hop polyphenol concentration out quicker. But I don't want to lose the stability, the colloidal stability of this, so we don't want it to clear out, basically. So anyway, let's add some yeast nutrient. That's always a good thing to do. Yeast nutrient there. Yeah. Okay. All right. So now let's do the dry hopping. Dry hops. Let's do the same. Let's do the same too. All right. So let's go Citra. We're not going to get too creative here because I know this is going to make a good New England IPA. So we're going to stick with this. And we're going to do dry hop. The thing we're going to do about dry hopping is it's really hard to identify how long your fermentation lasts, especially under pressure fermenting. It may last a little longer. So we do not want to biotransform with this recipe. It's too unpredictable until you know what you're doing and you know what yeasts that you're using and how they play with the hops that you have in this recipe. So for now, if you want to make a good one, stop with the biotransforming. You can play with that later. All right, dry hop for 1 day. Yes, 1 day. And I'm just going to put 7 days here because I don't know how long the fermentation is going to last. And we're going to add our last cheater hops. We're going to go with Mosaic again. And why am I not getting? There we go. Okay. Dry hop. And we're going to do it for 1 day at room temperature. And we'll say it's going to start on day 7. All right, here's our base recipe. You can play around with this a little bit. I have used lemon drop here, and with good success. If you want to use some lemon drop, go ahead and throw it in now. I found it to do really well at flame out. So let's say you want to add, say, lemon drop hops. You don't have to do this. This part right here, the recipe that we have already works beautifully. But let's play around with this. So we're going to go with the boil. We're going to go 2 ounces, and it's basically flame out. So 0 minutes. And that brought our slider up a little bit. It may be too much. We could back off. If we wanted to back off to, let's say, 1.5 ounces, that's fine. So as this recipe stands, it's really good. This will make a nice basic New England IPA. It'll be good on your first run as long as you follow this recipe. Now, if you want to make it even a little better, I have done this before. I've added fruit, and the best one to add to a New England IPA, in my opinion, is mango puree. And you can add 3 pounds of that. And it says in the secondary. You can release the pressure, open up your fermenter, drop the puree in there, close the fermenter back up and repressurize it back to 10 psi. And then whatever oxygen you may have introduced, but you probably didn't. But if you did, there would still be some fermentation going on. Allow that oxygen to be used up prior to the end of fermentation. Okay, and the last thing we want to do is choose a yeast. So we want to choose a yeast that's really designed for New England IPAs. And let's see here. Yeast. So London Ale yeasts are safe. You can do a USO4 too if you want. Let's do London Ale. See what pops up here. Let's do London Ale 3. There are a bunch of different ones you can use. We'll just use this one, but any one of them. You can even use some of the dry yeast. Let's see here. Doesn't look like they have it listed, so you'd have to add it. Oh, there's the New England East Coast IPA, or ale rather. That is one of their older ones, but they had one that was called, or they have a new one called Verdant. Yeah, see, it's not in there. That's another dry yeast that I have that I want to try, but yeah, you're welcome to do dry yeast. There's plenty of options out there for dry yeast for New England IPAs, and liquid yeast as well. Imperial has some good ones. So let's just for brevity's sake, let's just say we're going to use London Ale yeast. All right. Now, it's not really important for us for the best yeast to biotransform, because the only hops that are really going to be biotransformed are the the kettle additions, but we are not going to worry about biotransforming the dry hop additions, because we are going to drop our hops after fermentation is complete, where we can transfer the beer to the keg 1 day after dry hopping. I almost forgot. If you are doing RO or distilled water, you'll definitely want to add some acid malt, some acidulated malt. And for this recipe, I'm using about 6 ounces of acidulated malt. If you're closer to 5.5 gallons, you'll probably be 4.5 ounces of acidulated malt. So acid malt here, I said 6. What is that? 0.38. Close enough. That will get our pH in the right range without having to worry too much about adding lactic acid to the mash.
So the next big deal here is a water profile. So if you don't already know what your local water profile is, then you'll want to get a water profile report, or you'll want to use RO water or distilled water. And then you're going to make sure that that water profile is set up so that there is a 2:1, which I prefer, chloride to sulfate ratio. If you're unable to achieve those numbers while keeping calcium under 75 parts per million, then you'll need to dilute your water with RO or distilled water to get to that point. And it gets really complicated. For your first time out, if you just go to the store and buy 10 gallons of distilled water, or reverse osmosis water, not the spring water, then it will be really easy. So if you don't have all the fancy scales, you can simply do this. A typical 5-gallon batch uses about 10 gallons of water. So when you buy the 10 gallons of RO water or distilled water, just add All right, now that we have the recipe, we have the water profile that we want to keep calcium under 75, I prefer around 50, and then the chloride to sulfate ratio of 2:1. Now you only need to buy your grains. If you don't have a mill, you'll want to make sure they milled your grains before you receive them. If you have a mill, great, then go ahead and mill your grains. And the brew day here, we're going to mash in between 148 and 150. Now the reason being is that the mouthfeel is already going to have a lot of proteins and a lot of viscosity to it, so we don't need to add to that. If you're making a really large New England IPA, you can swing towards the 150, 148 and 150. And some of you may say, well, this is an IPA, why would you mash in such a low temperature? Reason being is that, one, we used half Golden Promise here. Golden Promise keeps a lot of residual sweetness while keeping the beer light. Second, there's a lot of flaked adjuncts in here, which high in proteins, which will give the beer enough viscosity. And third, we did a 2:1 chloride to sulfate ratio, which gives the beer a silky mouthfeel. So we're gonna mash for 1 hour between 148 and 150. We're gonna boil off or recirculate, and after 1 hour, raise to 172 and mash out. All right, now we get started in the boil. In my New England IPAs, I like a very small bittering charge. Some people say you don't need it. That's fine, you can try without it. This recipe does have a small bittering charge, and I like that to set the stage. You can do this at 60 or 30 minutes, it really doesn't matter, or forego it altogether, it's up to you. But if you want to follow along this recipe, you'll see at the end, the results are great. And that's it in the boil. We have no other hop additions. The next hop addition comes in at the whirlpool or hop stand. If you don't have a whirlpool port, you can stir the wort and get a whirlpool going, or you can just let it set. But the important thing here is you're going to have to chill the wort a little bit. And you need to get it down to 190 before you drop your whirlpool hops in. You're going to let the hops sit in the whirlpool for 10 minutes, no longer. Then you're going to be cooling to the fermenter. All right, the reason being is that it's not instantaneous cooling, and it takes time to chill it down to get to the fermenter. So those hops will be sitting in the hop stand over a much longer period of time than just the 10 minutes. The conventional wisdom here was 20 minutes. It's overkill, and there's a higher chance for you of extracting that resinous compound called myrcene. Then begin cooling your pitching temperatures, or as close to you can get to your pitching temperatures, or directly into the fermenter if you have a counterflow chiller or a plate chiller. So the research has shown that more of the geraniol and the linalool is extracted early, very early on in the whirlpool. Okay, before you start transferring your chilled wort into your fermenter, you want to make sure that you've put your dry hops in your muslin bag with the 2 earth magnets. Actually, you'll want to use 4, but you'll use 2 on each side of the bag so you can hold it up higher. And I'll show you that in a moment. Okay, this is a Firmzilla. With the Firmzilla, it does have this at the bottom where you can add hops. I find this a little complicated, and I'm always suspect of adding hops in after fermentation is complete, even when purging this with CO2 using the dump valve. I just don't do it anymore. So I'm showing you here with the hop bag and the earth magnet. With a muslin bag, what I do is I stretch it around with 2 magnets. I have the 2 magnets on the outside. It's high enough up here where the hops are just sitting suspended over the beer, and when it's time to drop the hops, I just remove the magnet and the hops drop in, okay? That's how these earth magnets come into play. So you're gonna anchor the stainless steel magnets in the bag to the inside of the fermenter, holding up the hops for your dry hop drop. And you want to make sure they're high enough so they're not sitting in the wort once you pour in your wort into the fermenter prior to fermentation. The idea is to have the hops sitting up above the wort, high enough. If the krausen hits it, it's not a big deal. It won't really cause any problems. The next thing you want to do is make sure you put your spunding valve on the top of the fermenter. And make darn sure, because I made this mistake once, make sure that it's on the gas port and not the liquid out port. Because if it's on the liquid out port, you're going to wake up to about 2 gallons of beer on the floor. Happened to me. All right, set your spunding valve to 10 psi-ish. So about 10 psi is a good pressure fermentation for a New England IPA. So remember what I said at the beginning about unexpected hop aromas. Well, here's where first timers get into a lot of trouble. They read about or they hear about people putting in hops and biotransforming, and wow, you get such a good beer when you biotransform. Let me tell you, results are very unpredictable with biotransformation. And when you find the right combination for biotransformation, and I mean right combination of hops versus yeast, then you found a magic bullet. Stick with it. Keep that in your tool chest because they're hard to come by. So we are not going to be biotransforming on this recipe. Don't do it on your first time around. All right. And a lot of the commercial brewers don't biotransform. There are a few, but there are some that do not. And in fact, probably more than half I've read do not biotransform. Once fermentation is complete, when you know it's complete is that you can pull a sample off the liquid outpost and take a Brix reading if you want by using a party tap, or you can fill up a hydrometer tube and float your hydrometer in there and see where you are. See if you're at terminal, you're pretty close to terminal. You'll know the pressure. Another way to do it is to release the pressure to, like, let's say 9 psi and see if the pressure comes back to 10. If it doesn't, then you're done. So the next thing you would do is release the magnets and let the hops drop in. Now, before you do this, make sure that within 36 to 48 hours, you're able to transfer this beer to a keg. Don't let it sit in there for 3 to 4 days. Again, undesired results. So next you'll need to have a closed transfer. Closed transfer meaning that the beer coming off of the fermenter is never going to see oxygen. It's going to go through a beer line, going directly into your keg that's already been purged of oxygen. And the way to do this is to get your keg and put water and star sand in like you normally do. Put the lid on, shake it around, dump out the excess star sand, put the lid back on. You're gonna have to make a couple of pigtails and make the gas post, the gas from the gas bottle, make that a liquid and then plug it into the liquid in post on your keg and then turn the gas on. This will push the gas down the liquid post and then up through the bottom. Now, remember, CO2 is heavier than air, but when CO2 first goes in, it's mixing and twisting around in there, and it's mixed with air. It takes a few minutes for basically the CO2 and the air to layer, and then the heavier CO2 will fall to the bottom, the air will stick to the top. Usually wait about 2 minutes, then burp the top of the keg. If it doesn't have a pressure release valve, then just use a gas ball lock that's nothing connected to it, and then you can burp the gas post. Do this maybe 1 or 2 times, and then you're ready to go. The next thing you need to do is hook up your liquid outpost from the pressure vessel or the fermentation vessel, in this case the Fermzilla, into the liquid post of your keg. And as soon as you do that, you should start seeing beer moving over. If you don't, you may need to release pressure on the keg by pulling the pressure release valve tab, or by placing the ball lock liquid connector on the ball lock gas outpost. And this will release some of the pressure. And then you should start seeing the beer moving at this point. So once you've connected all this and you've burped the keg, the beer will stop moving at some point. Then you'll need to connect the gas post to the top of the Firmzilla gas in post to push the rest of the beer out of the Firmzilla or all-rounder or whatever device you're using into your new keg or your fresh keg. Once all the beer is moved over, you're done basically. The keg is full and you're gonna put it in your kegerator. Once you get it into your kegerator, you're gonna put the gas on it. Don't try to gas it too quickly. Just put it under the normal gas that you normally have for serving pressure and let it set, because you're gonna let this beer set for 2 weeks. You're not gonna touch the beer other than to take a little bit of sample every now and then. And really, you're not drinking that sample. You're just pulling the sediment off the bottom, because as this beer cools and carbonates, some of the hop sediment, some of the heavier stuff will sink to the bottom. After 2 weeks, it should have been about a week in the fermenter, depending on the fermentation, maybe 12 days. After 2 weeks in the kegerator, you should be fully carved and the harshness and hop bite will have subsided, and you'll end up with this. So if you sample it too early, it's going to be harsh. Don't be disappointed. Just go ahead and do a couple of small pours, about this much, maybe after 5 days, and then another 5 days. And then by the time you're actually ready to drink it, the first pour might be a little dirty, and then after that, they should look like this. So that color is now solid, and it should not change. I have done this many times. So it's just me drinking these New England IPAs typically. There's only one other friend that I have that likes them locally. Otherwise than that, sometimes I will can these and ship them out. But I have sat on a full keg of New England IPA for, depending on how much I have on tap, other beers that I like, I could sit on this beer for 8 weeks. And even at 8 weeks, it will come out looking like this if you follow those steps. Wow. So we got big mango aromas, citrus, juicy, even a little vanilla. It smells amazing. The head dissipates very quickly though with these beers, with all that hop compound and dry hopping just knocks the head down. I should have said cheers. So the hop bite is gone completely. I'm left with this juicy, nice smooth mouthfeel, not chalky. It's almost as if a no alcohol bite at all. No hop bite. Very, very much the aroma that you get when you pour it follows through on the palate in the back. Doesn't leave any burning or harshness on the back of your throat. They go down super easy. Yeah, they're so crushable that you can really get yourself tanked on this really quick. Yeah, so that is it. If you follow the steps in this recipe, your beer should look like this. Now, there's a few things you can do to actually extend the life a little further. You can use vitamin C or ascorbic acid, and you can pretty much just put that right in the keg when you're racking off into the keg after you've purged it with the CO2. You've already put the ascorbic acid in the keg. I don't use it, but I have heard people who use it that get good results with it as well, that do not adhere to some of the strict standards I talked about in transferring in a closed system. So if you already use ascorbic acid, you would just mix some in a little bit of sanitized water. In other words, you brought water to a boil the same way you would do with gelatin. You mix it in there, let it cool, and dump it into the keg. After you've sanitized it, put the lid on, and then do your purging process. Remember, you're putting CO2 in the liquid post, so it's not going to squirt any of that out. It's just going to bubble a little bit at the bottom. And then when you're racking your beer into your keg under pressure, under CO2 with no oxygen, it'll be in there, it'll mix with the beer, and that will also extend the shelf life if you want to. It may even help with bottling and or canning if you're going to send these beers out to folks, because two things will kill a New England IPA: oxygen and heat. The absorbic acid does help with both of those situations anecdotally. I can't, there's no real scientific evidence that states that it does, but there's anecdotal evidence out there on the internet that it does. So, it doesn't hurt the beer, why not try it? Okay. Bottling or canning, one of the things you want to make sure is that you are using a beer gun. You need to have some way of forcing CO2 into the vessel you're filling. And if you're bottling, I like to fill the bottle all the way up to the top. Don't leave any headspace. You can use those oxygen absorbing caps if you want. I don't take any chances. I fill it all the way to the top and cap it. Now, if I'm canning, I do the same thing. I cap on foam, I purge, I fill the can, overfill it, and I actually fill a little fast so that it creates a little bit of a head. Not a lot, just a little. And then I cut the head with the lid of the can and seal it immediately. And I have good results with that as well. I can get shelf life of 8 weeks or more as long as it stays refrigerated, and it will look like this 8 weeks later, 10 weeks later. The hop presence may be subdued and start to fade a little bit, but the beer will not oxidize and it will look bright and beautiful just like this. If ever you're having a bad day, go back to this recipe, brew it, and you will be very satisfied. All right, I hope you found this helpful. I hope you found it informative. If you have any questions, please put them in the comments below. And welcome to the channel. Please like and subscribe. Cheers.